population-level estimates of prevalence of anti-SARS-CoV-2 antibody positivity is a crucial epidemiological indicator for tracking the COVID-19 epidemic. Such data are in short supply, both internationally and in South Africa. The South African National Blood Service and the Western Cape Blood Service coordinated a nationally representative survey of blood donors. The organizations hoped the survey could be a cost-effective surveillance method with validity for community-level seroprevalence estimation. SANBS Clinical Investigations Lead says during the Omicron wave, they saw new patterns of illness and transmission. He says they included clear evidence that various forms of pre-existing immunity are not as effective against acquisition of the Omicron variant as they would have been against earlier variants such as Beta and Delta.
Marion Vermeulen is the SANBS Executive for Transfusion Medicine Technical Services and a Principal Investigator. She joins us now via Zoom for a little bit more on this. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having us, and yeah, thank you.
All right, let's start with helping our viewers understand what the story actually tells us. So explain to us what you're looking for in the blood donors. What are these antibodies? What do they tell us?
So we're looking for antibodies in the donors. So when you've been, either if you've been exposed to SARS-CoV-2 or had COVID, then you will develop antibodies to fight off the illness. And that also then starts to give you some kind of protection in the future as well. So the studies, we've done 3 cross-sectional studies, one in January, one in May, and then this last recent one in November. So the January and the May one was after Beta, but prior to the Delta wave. And so we looked to see how many people of our blood donors had antibodies, and then we used that information to extrapolate back into the general population. So we know that our donors aren't a true reflection of the general population, but we were able to look and see that there were really very little differences between gender and between age group, and so we used other variables to extrapolate back. So then in November, we did exactly the same thing, another cross-sectional study where we just randomly selected blood donors across a few days and tested them again for the antibodies. And again, we only used a test that tests specifically for antibodies where somebody's actually been exposed. So we didn't test to see if anyone had been, if people had been vaccinated. It was specifically to determine that they actually had an illness. And then this one was before Omicron, but after Delta. So we could then see the difference between the 2 waves.
All right, so were you asking the donors, have you been ill with COVID-19, or you tested to see if there was evidence that they had been ill?
So we asked the donors if they would be willing to be if they consent to be in the study. And if they consented, then we tested the residual samples that were left over from our normal testing. And in the first 2 in January and in May last year, there we tested we tested the people who consented, and we then actually afterwards, we haven't published this, but we went back and we asked all the donors who tested positive and an equal number of donors who tested negative. We asked them various questions. We asked them whether they had been diagnosed with COVID before. If they had been diagnosed, did they have symptoms, and if so, what were the symptoms? And if they hadn't been diagnosed, also did they have flu-like symptoms at any point during the season before? And so we were able there, we haven't, as I say, we haven't published that work, but we were able there to find that about 50% of people who had COVID actually had no idea whatsoever that they had it. They were totally asymptomatic, hadn't been diagnosed at all.
All right.
So yes, we didn't do that in this study. In this November study, we just tested the blood, but we didn't actually go back to the donors.
All right. So tell us a little bit about what you found your first set of tests and your second ones. What is it telling us about what's been going on with the COVID-19 story?
So there's a few things. In the first set of data that we published, we showed there that there was a difference between race group and also a difference between geographic regions. With Eastern Cape having a really high prevalence at the time, we had reported that we estimated in the general population that the Eastern Cape was around about 63%. The whole country we estimated was around 47%. And then I think it was the Northern Cape was around 30%. In this testing that we've just now recently done, the first thing that's quite noticeable is that the differences between the provinces has disappeared. They're all relatively close to one another now. And I think that's probably something to do with the fact that obviously people who had been exposed already before, they had antibodies and therefore didn't have such a high rate of exposure in the Delta wave, whereas people who didn't or provinces who hadn't been exposed so much, they didn't have any background antibodies. And so, of course, more infections then happened with Delta. And so now they're all relatively close. We now are estimating that across the general population, probably around about 71%. And it sort of ranges between 65 to around about 80%.
All right. I mean, what you're saying is that over 2/3 of South Africans have probably had COVID-19, and most of those had no idea.
Absolutely. And that's before Omicron came. So
Wow.
I think it's probably much closer to, I would reckon it's probably closer to 90% by now.
Of people that have been infected at some point or the other?
I think so. I mean, so we are going to do that testing now. We're just waiting for reagents. That's actually the hold up. But once we are able to get reagents, we want to do, after now Omicron's now sort of finished, that we do another survey to have a look to see what the level of antibodies are. And of course, even in the testing that we did now, that where we've said around about 71%, that's people who have got antibodies now, and some of the people who had the wild type virus back in the very, very, very first wave, those antibodies will have waned and we wouldn't be detecting those anymore. So there's probably is more people who have actually had it, and yeah, absolutely totally unaware.
And has each wave produced a new kind of antibody? So Delta to Beta to Omicron?
So not with so they may be different, but we can't detect them at the moment with the tests that are available at the moment. We can't differentiate between the variants of concern at all.
Right.
We can depending on the test that we use, we can differentiate between whether you have antibodies developed by a vaccine only, or whether you have antibodies developed from exposure. But if you have been exposed and been vaccinated, we can't tell that difference. So we can only tell if you've been vaccinated and not been exposed.
So are we talking about a significant amount of herd immunity? And I suppose the variable there is when you got your antibodies and if they're still efficacious, if there's such a word.
So yeah, I mean, herd immunity is a tricky one, because we know and we've seen that even if you have antibodies, that does not mean that you're not going to be reinfected.
Right.
So it doesn't protect you necessarily against, or doesn't fully, not 100% anyway, doesn't fully protect you against being reinfected or getting another infection. But it does definitely seem to be giving some protection against severity of illness. So it doesn't give, as we all know now, doesn't give full protection at all. But it is, I mean, I think Pfizer's giving around, I think they say about 35 to 40% protection still. So, I mean, there is protection, but not.
All right, so you might get infected, but chances are you're not going to get hospitalized. That's kind of what the story is. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. I think those antibodies, they're there already. You have a memory response, so those antibodies kick in very, very quickly, and they stop the virus from really taking hold.
So what does this mean for blood donation? I mean, if I suddenly need a transfusion, should I be worried about getting antibodies, or is this a good thing? What's the deal?
No, so you don't have to be worried about it. So first of all, the majority of transfusions that we give are red blood cells. That's the drive. The drive behind transfusion is red blood cells, and the virus, should I say, the antibodies don't actually. They're not on the red blood cells. They transport it in your plasma. So that's the first part. We do, of course, transfuse plasma as well, but I'm not sure if you know or if you remember, but there were also many, many studies performed around the world and in South Africa as well on convalescent plasma. So that was plasma that we purposefully collected from donors who had COVID and had recovered and convalesced, and we used those antibodies to then give back to people who were hospitalized with COVID as a passive treatment. So because there was no treatment available and they hadn't started to build up their own antibodies, the hypothesis was that these passive antibodies could potentially help them. So it turned out that by the time somebody's hospitalized, the antibodies don't really have much help. But what we did determine from all of that is that millions of transfusions around the world were given like that, and no safety issues whatsoever. So long story, but the antibodies in your plasma are not of any.
All right. So people must go out in their numbers, donate, and those receiving must feel safe. Fantastic. Marion, thank you.
Absolutely. And we really do need blood donors. I have to just make this punt. We really do need blood donors. So the more the merrier, please.
Fantastic. Marion, thank you so much indeed. Fascinating research. Great to talk to you.
Thank you. You too. Good evening.
Good night. All right, that's Marion Vermeulen, who's a South African National Blood Service Executive for Transfusion, Medicine and Technical Services, joining us to talk about this interesting study that's come out looking at antibodies in blood donors. After the first wave, 47% of the people had antibodies, and now that's shot up to 71%. And she reckons that with Omicron, it could be as many as 91%. But please go and get vaccinated. COVID is still with us. Wear a mask, do all the protocols, even though this is great news.